to A Theory of Everything. I'm Razo, the director of EISM and host of this channel. Today I'm talking to Dr. Hugh Ross. Ross earned a PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto and a bachelor's in physics from the University of British Columbia. He also did a 5-year postdoc at Caltech. He's written a number of books, one of them about string theory, which is of special interest to me and this channel. In today's exchange, we talk about Dr. Ross's beliefs as a Christian. In particular, we talk about how Ross proposes to reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of an all-good and all-powerful God. This has long been held as the most challenging question for Christian intellectuals, and rightly so, because the two things don't seem to jibe. Every Christian I've ever heard try to answer this question inevitably stumbles, and I think you'll agree that Dr. Ross is no exception here. However, he was nice enough to allow me to play devil's advocate, respectfully challenging the language that he uses, which, at least for me, is difficult to understand. He definitely had a hard time explaining, for example, how or why God allows small children to be abused. What's nice is that Dr. Ross has agreed to come back to discuss physics more in depth. And I'm definitely going to take him up on that because, as I explained in our inaugural lecture, physics is the foundation of everything, even theology. If you can't explain your theology in terms of physics, you run the risk of fooling yourself, at least from a scientific perspective. As always, you'll find a timestamp in the video description. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I hope you'll come back for our second exchange. Thank you. Dr. Ross, welcome to A Theory of Everything. You are in Covina, and I'm in Barcelona. I grew up in La Habra, so we're actually not that far away in terms of where we've been in the past, at least. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. And yeah, I mean, my wife and I were in Barcelona just a year ago, so we're close together in two respects.
I think there's some other things that also unite us. One is a love for science. So today we're going to talk about probably one of the most difficult questions for somebody who defends Christianity, at least from my perspective, and that's the existence of evil. So in the preparation for this exchange, I did send a message, and I'd like to read that message just to contextualize and initiate our discussion.
Go for it.
So what I'd like to do is play a respectful devil's advocate regarding the existence of evil and what science and logic might have to say about it. Every apologist I've ever heard trying to explain away the existence of evil is irreconcilable with the concept of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God. The Christian responses to evil are all acceptable for a person of faith, but for a person who does not believe, that is, from a purely logical and scientific perspective, they do not seem acceptable. I'll take a similar approach to your claim that science, as we understand it today, proves God. I don't think science proves God in any normal scientific sense of the term proof. What seems clear from both a scientific and religious perspective is that we don't want to destroy ourselves as a species, which is what it seems we're doing. In this context, salvation becomes the critical idea, in my opinion. Open questions about science and evil hinge on the question of salvation. What does it mean? And how do we get there in a way that's understandable to both science and religion? So that's the initial message that I did send. So why don't we begin with the first question, the question of evil. And before I let you speak, I'd like to say that I think there's natural evil in the natural world, right? Like things like earthquakes and hurricanes that kill people. And then there's the other kind of evil, the human evil. And I will let you say whatever you'd like to say, But my concern will be with the second type, which is the human type of evil. So Dr. Ross, please, if you would, go ahead. What do you have to say about the existence of evil and how to reconcile it with an all-loving and all-powerful God?
Well, first of all, I don't use the term natural evil because I don't think it's evil. When we look at, say, earthquakes and tornadoes and floods, tsunamis, hurricanes, disease, parasites, when we put them in the context of the laws of physics that govern the universe, we see that each one of those things that we call a natural evil is actually optimized to minimize our suffering and death. So, for example, if we had fewer earthquakes, we'd be in a worse spot than we are now. If we had more earthquakes, we'd also be in a worse spot. It's at an optimal level. And we see that's the case with hurricanes. There's actually benefits we get from hurricanes. But again, this is all in the context of the laws of physics. The skeptic could respond and say, well, couldn't God just choose different laws of physics? And therefore we wouldn't have to have earthquakes and hurricanes and diseases. We could, but then we would not have in God's hand the tools to eradicate evil in the context of free will. And it's interesting you bring this up because I've debated a lot of atheist scientists on this issue of evil and suffering. And what I find interesting, it typically boils down as to whether or not human free will is real. Because, one of the traditional responses to the problem of evil is to say, well, God wanted love. And to have love, he has to create free will beings. And if he wants to have really intimate, deep, lasting, loving relationships, he has to give us strong free will, not just weak free will. And if you grant creative beings strong free will, then some inevitably are going to choose to rebel and disobey and follow a path of evil. And so what I find with a lot of atheist scientists is say, well, we don't believe free will is real. We think everything is deterministic. Just look at the laws of physics. And so it really boils down to, is there actual true human free will? And I think there's overwhelming evidence that there is, which means there must be something special about the laws of physics, whereby God can grant us humans strong free will, where it's inevitable as some of us are going to use that free will not to love God, but to hate God. That's an inevitable consequence. But how is it that God has structured the laws of physics and the cosmic space-time dimensions to bring about the eventual complete eternal eradication of evil? And I wound up writing a whole book on that topic called Why the Universe is the Way It Is, basically addressing the question of the problem of evil in the context of what we now understand to be these laws of physics that govern the entirety of the universe.
Okay, can you delve a little more deeply into exactly how the laws of physics explain or justify the evil? Let me give you a little more context regarding the difficulty that a devil's advocate would have accepting this. A minister or a priest molests a little child. How do the laws of physics explain away the fact that this molestation is reconcilable with an all-loving, all-powerful God?
Well, it's something you see in the very early chapters of the Bible, chapter 3 of Genesis, where we have the original human pair, Adam and Eve, and they use their strong free will to rebel against God and to experience evil personally. God was prepared to instruct them about evil, but instead they chose to experience it personally. And God says, as a result of that decision, from now on, you're going to be experiencing more work than you otherwise would, more pain, as we see in the book of Ecclesiastes, also more wasted time. And the principle is the laws of physics and the space-time dimensions are designed in such a way that the more evil we humans commit, the more pain we have to go through, the more time we have to expend, and the more work we have to do to undo the damage that results from our evil. And also explains why it tells us in the Bible, those who have authority have the responsibility to ensure that the perpetrators of the evil are the ones that experience the consequences of more wasted time, more pain, and more work. But for example, as a physicist, I look at things like gravity and thermodynamics and electromagnetism. I won't go into the strong and weak nuclear force, just use those physical laws that most people are familiar with. It's easy to see how they've been designed, fine-tuned to an optimal degree to ensure that the more evil we commit, the more pain we're going to experience, the more work we're going to have to do, and the more time we're going to waste to undo the damage that comes from that evil. And notice we're all biologically designed so that none of us likes extra work or wasted time or extra pain. And so the laws of physics themselves actually provide us with a natural motivation to avoid evil, if for no other reason, to avoid having to experience more pain, more work, and more wasted time. But as a parent, I've noticed how skilled my children are at transferring the consequences for their evil deeds to me instead of to them. And so one of the challenges of being a father is to ensure that I'm not the one who cleans up the damage. I make sure my sons are the ones that got to clean up the damage. And likewise, we see in the Bible that God gives authority to the government, the police, the army, to ensure that the perpetrators of the evil are the ones that experience extra time, extra work, and wasted time, extra pain. And I really appreciate the way you put the gospel into this, the salvation message, because as we look at these laws of physics, it's easy to come to the understanding. I do not have the capability within myself to do what I know I need to do. The laws of physics are telling me, avoid evil, you'll experience less pain, less work, and less wasted time. But no matter how hard I try to motivate myself to avoid evil, I wind up doing it anyway, at least to some degree. And that's how the laws of physics basically tell us. Look at the world of nature. Look at the entirety of the universe. As an astronomer, I can tell you, we need the entire universe of several 100 billion galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars in them, to have one planet on which advanced life can exist. The whole universe exists to make planet Earth and our human existence possible. That's just one piece of scientific evidence that the one that created the universe must have extreme power. Look at all he's done to make possible our existence. And also must have a high degree of care. In other words, he did not think it was too expensive to build a universe of 50 billion trillion stars, where that adds up to just 0.25% of all the stuff of the universe, so that we could have a nice place to live. And when then you look at the 8.5 billion species of eukaryotic life forms that God created on this planet, and they only existed during the human era. Before us, there was less. And so you see all that God has provided and realize there must be a very powerful and very caring and loving being behind the universe. And therefore, if we're stuck in a situation where the laws of physics are not enough to deliver us from doing evil, he himself must have provided a way. And that's really the heart of the Christian salvation message, is that God is prepared. He is so powerful and so loving, so wise and knowledgeable and intelligent, that he has provided a means to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And
Oh,
and yeah, go ahead.
okay, well, forgive me if I dwell on this a bit more, and again, go back to the devil's advocate.
Mm-hmm.
I might be able to understand and accept the idea that, for the sake of argument, that okay, the person who perpetrates evil The laws of physics are designed in such a way that the person suffers more than a person who does not perpetrate evil. As a matter of fact, I have an argument myself that I base on the principle of least action, which Juan Maldacena, the renowned string theorist, refers to as the principle of maximal life. And I think it's a beautiful way to refer to it. And I think because that's so fundamental, a physical principle, that it explains morality itself and why nature, God punishes things that cause life to shorten at all levels of abstraction in physics. But going
Right.
back to the main point I want to get across here, again, as a devil's advocate, the perpetrator in the case of a priest who molests a child is the priest. But one could argue that the child suffers infinitely more than the priest. So how would you reconcile this concept that physics and the universe and all of the laws makes the child suffer more than the priest? Is the child, well, we know, at least from experience, it doesn't seem logical to say that the child is the perpetrator of the molestation.
Well, that's all true. And what the laws of physics do is ensure that the human race as a whole experiences more pain, more work, and wasted time in proportion to the evil that the entire human race has committed, which is why it's so important that those who've been vested with authority ensure that the perpetrators are the ones that experience the extra pain, extra work, and wasted time. And therefore, those in authority over that priest need to be the ones that ensure that that priest suffers the appropriate consequences. And by doing so, restraining other priests, for example, of considering to do the same thing. And so these laws of physics apply to humanity in general, but not to humanity in particular. And that's why I gave the example of my sons. And I think any parent has experienced that. The people who commit evil are very skilled at transferring the consequences to the innocent. In this case, the child that got molested. So the innocent suffers, which is why those in authority are basically been commanded by scripture to say, okay, you are responsible to make sure that the perpetrators are the ones that suffer, not the innocent victims. And
Okay.
if you don't do that, you're going to have more innocent people suffering. However, it's inevitable that some people, just like the laws of physics, are going to ensure that some people are going to get cancer, some people are going to get disease. But if we're careful, we can minimize that level. And keep in mind, one of the hallmarks of the Christian faith is the moment that evil is eradicated. No more gravity, no more electromagnetism, no more entropy or thermodynamics, no more strong and weak nuclear forces, and we get radically different dimensions governing the new creation. And so these laws of physics and space-time dimensions are only in place as long as evil exists in God's creation. Once it's eradicated, there's no longer a need for this universe or its laws of physics. And so we get delivered into a new realm where our free will, as strong as it is now, is going to become exponentially stronger. And people often say, well, why doesn't God give us that exponentially stronger free will now? If he did, evil would run out of control. He's actually fine-tuned the degree of free will capability in every human being to ensure that evil gets eradicated as efficiently and rapidly as possible. But once it is, we're going to be granted a much stronger free will, which means we're going to be able to experience a much deeper level of intimacy and love and rewarding relationships with one another. As it is, we have some of that now, but we're going to get a whole lot more in the future, but not until evil is eradicated and not until everyone's been exposed to the test. Because that's another principle behind all of this, is you cannot have strong free will and eternally secure relationships, loving relationships, without those relationships being put to the ultimate test. And that's something else you see in chapter 3 of Genesis, the third page of the Bible. What does God do the moment that Adam and Eve rebel against him? He allows Satan to come into the garden. He is the most powerful and intelligent created being, which means that Adam and Eve, and through Adam and Eve, all the rest of humanity, get exposed to the most challenging tests in the context of evil. And if you pass the most challenging tests, there's no other test that can possibly trip you up. And one analogy I can use is not a good analogy, but I'll use it anyway. I have a PhD in astrophysics, and that PhD guarantees that never again will I have to be tested for my competency in astrophysics. And it's based on the principle I've already been subjected to the most difficult tests possible in my chosen discipline, so it's pointless to test me again. So that PhD I have basically guarantees no more testing. It's completely unnecessary. Likewise, every human being gets exposed to the most challenging tests, and with God's help, we can pass that test. I mean, I think another interesting, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I think we'll come back to your academic training. I think it's relevant. But first, forgive me if I ask you if you can understand from a non-Christian perspective, somebody who doesn't believe, how your inability to explain the molestation of a child with the existence of an all-loving God, everything you explain after that to a person who doesn't believe sounds like doesn't make sense.
Well, you can think it's kind of like dodging the question. And my whole point was notice the laws of physics in the space time dimensions govern the entirety of the universe, all the way back to time equals zero. It's a principle we can verify in astrophysics. No matter where we look in the universe, no matter how far back in time we see, the laws of physics are identical to what we measure in the laboratory. That's actually stated as well in Jeremiah 33 and Romans 8 in the Bible, that God established the laws of physics to be constant, unvariable, until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem from evil, in fact, have been redeemed. And when that happens, we get completely different laws of physics. Now, given that the laws of physics apply to the entirety of the universe, we have a general principle, but we don't get a particular principle, which is why I think it's not quite appropriate to say, well, how about this single instance? It's kind of like what happens when I run into atheists and say, well, I've got this grandmother and she lived a very good life, but she was not a Christian. Is God going to send her to hell? And it's like, well, I don't know all the particular details of that situation. Therefore, it's hard for me to make an appropriate answer. I can talk to you about the general principle, but the particular, unless I have all the data, I'm not able to give you a good answer. And the case of that child that got molested by the priest, we don't have all the data, but we do have data on the general principle, what happens to the entirety of humanity. And one reason I believe in strong free will, notice how many humans do choose to reject God's offer. And incidentally, with respect to that grandmother, I give a general answer. Okay, if she wants to spend eternity with God, God's got a place where she can do that. If she wants nothing whatsoever to do with God, God's got a place. And so, how I answer the atheists say, nobody gets sent to hell, they choose hell. If they want nothing to do with God, God says, I'll give you what you desire. I'll have nothing to do with you. But if you want to spend eternity with me in a loving relationship with me, I've got a place for you. It's your choice. And that's something you see in the Gospel of John. God sends out his light, his love, life, and truth to every human being through the different spiritual channels he has. If we reject that light and want nothing to do with what God's love, life, and truth, then hell is the place for you. But if you receive it and accept it, that's what I want, then heaven is a place for you. So again, I believe in this principle of strong free will. It's not God basically forcing us into a robotic response. He really has given us strong free will. And I think what's exciting is as strong as our free will is, the promise is we can get even stronger free will if we allow God to do for us what we can't do for ourselves.
Well, I think that's logical from a Christian perspective. It certainly is. But I think from once again, forgive me for insisting on this, but from a non-Christian perspective, the devil's advocate approach, it's very difficult to accept this line of reasoning when innocent small children are suffering such serious evils, such as molestation, and there's many other evils that it's hard to reconcile with the idea that there is a God who is a person who's all loving. And I might give an analogy here. We as parents, any healthy parent would be horrified by the idea of letting their child suffer in any way, much less be molested. And we're just humans. We're not all powerful or all knowing. We don't have the ability to stop. Yet it's said that God is all powerful and all knowing, yet he allows children to be raped. Does it
Right.
make sense?
Well, I actually address that very question in this book, making the point that God certainly has the power to miraculously intervene and rescue that child from that incident. He has the power, if you get cancer, to cure you from cancer. And we actually have documented cases where we can actually see clearly God has miraculously intervened to heal people, to save them from disasters, but he does it infrequently rather than frequently. And so the skeptic could say, well, why doesn't God do it more often? Well, notice that we see in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, there are many times where he said, I've done these miracles. Why are you asking me to do more? Your request for me to do more is basically going to cause you to focus on the physical and not on the far more important spiritual. So often he said, I'm not going to do the miracle. But one of the things I explain in this book, if God were to intervene as frequently as we would desire to intervene, and I take this personally, I've gone through a lot of life struggles myself and health issues. And yes, it would have been great if God had intervened on my behalf. But the message is this: if you were to intervene more frequently than he already does, it would blunt the benefit of the laws of physics and the space-time dimensions to eradicate evil quickly and efficiently. So yes, God could save all children from molestation, but if he were to do that, it would delay the eradication of evil and suffering. And it's God's intent to eradicate that evil and suffering as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And Jesus made a reference to this. In this world, you'll have tribulation, but be encouraged. I have overcome the world. I've got things under control, and I am in the process of eradicating evil and suffering as efficiently as possible. And particularly what you see in the New Testament epistles, it says, if you will commit to allow God to do for you what you're not able to do for yourself, from that point forward, all the bad things that happen in your life ultimately will work out for good. And you'll be able to see that good in your own lifetime. And I just taught a series on this, basically making the point, if that is you, put it to the test. And so what's interesting is that people who have been in that kind of relationship with Jesus Christ, the Creator, for decades, they can look back in their life and document, yes, at the moment, this was a terrible tragedy in my life, but it worked out for an incredible glory and good. And I'm so grateful that God took me through that challenge.
Okay. Well, I think
Now, keep in
obviously,
mind, there are conditions.
yes, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say
No,
that
I mean, there are
obviously,
conditions in the sense.
forgive me. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the two conditions are This will work for people who love God and are called according to his purpose. In other words, you want that relationship with God, and you actually understand the mission that God has for you in this life. And if that's the case, you get a guarantee. Every bad thing that happens in your life is going to work out for an incredible good that will make the bad thing look trivial by comparison. And so, again, the whole principle is we need to interpret everything we see, molestations, disease, cancer, everything, wars, in the context of God trying to efficiently and as rapidly as possible eliminate evil and suffering. One thing I've done as a physicist, we could tweak the laws of physics and make it so that we don't experience, say, decay and suffering at the rate that we do. But now it would take millions and billions of years to eradicate evil instead of thousands of years. And so I would say to the skeptic, which way would you rather have it? Would you rather have to be exposed to this evil and suffering for millions of years, or just thousands of years? Or kind of what my professors told me. It says, we could reduce the level of suffering you're going through to get this PhD, but it's going to take you 15 years. Would you rather suffer for 3 years or 4 years, or suffer for 15 years? And I said, I think I'd buy the 4 years instead of the 15 years. And having gone through that whole PhD process, I realized, my professors really put me through it. However, I'm grateful that they did. I'm grateful they pushed me as hard as they did. I'm also grateful that when I entered the graduate program at the University of Toronto, our professor sat down the entire freshman graduate class and said, "You 13 are the cream of the crop. We selected the most hardworking and talented students in all of Canada. However, what we're going to put you through here at the university is so challenging and rigorous, you're not going to pass if you don't get our help." And of the 13 of us, only 7 of us got the PhD. And of those 6, the problem was they did not take the offer of help that the professors provided. But there's an important difference with respect to the Christian faith. God says, if you come to me for help, I guarantee you'll pass. My professors didn't give me a guarantee. They just said it would help. But God says, if you come to me to do what you can't do for yourself, I guarantee you'll pass this most challenging test. And the remarkable thing is, we can pass it in just 70, 80, or 90 years. It doesn't take thousands of years. We only have to spend a few decades within this universe.
Okay, well, very interesting. Obviously, from a Christian perspective, I I agree with you, and your ideas and thoughts are very consistent with my own beliefs as a Christian. However, I I think no, I don't think I know that the vast majority of physicists would have trouble with this language. What do you have to say about that?
Well, it's something I shared earlier is that when I do have these conversations with scientists who are not theists, they basically say everything you say makes sense, but I don't believe that we humans have free will. I believe we're robots. And so then we get into a debate. Are we humans really living in something like the Matrix? We're all taking the blue pill instead of the red pill? Or is there really strong scientific evidence that we do have free will? And it's interesting, and in the last 15 years, there's been a vigorous debate amongst physicists who are atheists and theists over whether or not human free will is real. But what I notice is some of the strongest arguments that we humans really do possess free will, and not just weak free will, but strong free will, is coming from the scientists who are not believers. I think it's something
I
you'd
think you're
expect
I
from
think
a
you're
theistic
absolutely right.
perspective.
I
Yeah.
think you're absolutely right about that. Yeah, that's very interesting. Very interesting. I'm sorry, continue, please.
And so I think that's really the core of the scientific debate, because if we really do have strong free will, then everything I've said from a theistic perspective makes sense. Of course, God's going to expose us to this challenging test because his goal is not to, for one thing, we need to understand he had the option of keeping humanity in a paradisical state like Adam and Eve experienced in Eden. He could have kept Satan away from that. He could have kept the demons away from that. And, we would have been in this paradisical state. However, we would not have an eternally secure relationship with God. To gain that eternally secure relationship, we must be exposed to the most challenging tests. Just like I cannot serve as an astrophysicist without being exposed to the most challenging tests. And yes, when I went through my graduate training, I suffered a lot. But I look back on it and say every bit of that suffering, I would do it again in an instant because what it delivered for me. And I've been both a professor and a student. As a professor, what I tell my students in the first class, my role as a professor is to make you suffer. But as a professor, I've tried to optimize the suffering so that you will benefit. But one thing I've noticed is that the students who are not as diligent or not as talented, they will complain about my suffering and say the suffering I'm putting through is way too much. And they wind up dropping out of the class, or they complain to the dean about me. But my top students come to me and say, you know what? Bring it on. I want more suffering. I really want to benefit maximally. And if I can get through this program in 3 years instead of 4, I want it. Bring it on. And it's something I experienced too as a student, is that when my professors bring it on, I actually assimilate the preparation of training much more efficiently than it would if I were to, say, stretch it out over a 5 or 6 year period. So I'm glad, for example, in my first year of graduate studies, my professors made me take 9 courses. I mean, it was grueling, very painful. I mean, I got very little sleep, but I managed to pass and get good grades in 9 courses in a 9-month period instead of taking 2.5 years like the rest of my fellow students. My professors looked at me and says, "We think you can do it. So let's see if you can pull this off." And they said, "If you can't do it, you can take your time." But because I did it in 9 months, I got a jump on my PhD thesis.
Well, that's very impressive, very interesting. You know that it reflects in your physical aspect. You maintain your health. You seem very vigorous. That's wonderful. I think that discipline that you have shines through, and that's congratulations for that.
Well,
I'd like
partly
to.
it's my hobby. I mean, I enjoy mountaineering. There's
Oh,
gorgeous mountains here in North America, especially in Canada and Alaska, but you can't enjoy it unless you're really in good physical and mental shape.
hmm. Well, very good, excellent, and it shows that you are good for that. Good for you. I'd like to switch to another very difficult question. I think from a Christian perspective. Well, from the perspective of a Christian who is using science to prove God's existence. So, if science proves God's existence, what kind of God is it? Is he Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Catholic? And what does science have to say about this?
Well, it's fairly straightforward to use scientific evidence to establish that there has to be some kind of creative agent that brought the universe into existence. And when I press my atheist scientist friends, I discover they're really not atheists. The vast majority of them are deists. They believe there is a causal agent behind the universe, but they reject the idea that this causal agent is a personal being. And that's where I marshal scientific evidence to say, notice fine tuning is ubiquitous. Every event in the universe, Earth and Earth's life, every component that makes up universe, Earth and Earth's life plays some role in making possible the existence of billions of human beings on a single planet within a few thousand years. I said,
Okay,
notice too that the
forgive
fine
me.
tuning rise.
Forgive me,
Yeah.
Dr. Ross. Forgive me if I give you a hard time about this. But the question is, okay, if God exists, is he Catholic, Protestant? If he's Protestant, which one of the hundreds of denominations is he? Is he Muslim? What does science have to say about this?
Okay, let me speed it up a little bit because I was taking too much time. Basically, the fine-tuning argument, if you push it to its total extent, establishes theism. That it's not just deism, it's a personal being, because only a personal being can manifest the attributes of intelligence, knowledge, creativity, power, and care. But how do you go from theism to answering your question?
Exactly.
And that's where I make the point that, yeah, the greatest exponentiation in accumulating evidence from fine tuning is in the context of what needs to be done to the universe, Earth, and Earth's life so that billions of humans can be redeemed from their sin and evil in just a few thousand years. And so this basically separates the Christian faith from what you see in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam, because redemption is at the core of what we see in the fine tuning argument. And it's actually something you see reflected in certain passages of the Bible, where it says that God began his works of redemption before he created anything at all. So long before the universe, God was working out his works of redemption. And so if we're talking about a God that redeems, and redeems not just a few, but billions, and redeems them within a short period of time, this means we're now looking at one of the predominant Christian faiths that are out there. And, you know, you ask the question, well, okay, if it's Christianity, do we go with the Protestant? Do we go with Orthodox? Do we go with Roman Catholic? And what I've found is that within all three branches of Christendom, you will find leaders at the top that 100% buy in to this doctrine of God redeeming billions of human beings within a short period of time. But you'll also find on all three branches of Christendom leaders that reject that concept. And so I don't like to basically say, you know what, it's Protestantism, it's not Catholicism, it's not Eastern Orthodox, because I found people, priests, leaders in all three branches that basically accept 100% of what we see in the book of nature, that God has designed the universe, Earth, and Earth's life to bring about the redemption of billions of human beings.
Well,
And
a question, Dr. Ross. How do you think this sounds to a Muslim physicist? A Muslim physicist, there are many of them. How do you
there
think
are
this
many of them.
how do you think this sounds to a Muslim theoretical physicist?
Well, I've engaged some Muslim physicists, and I found that a lot of them really aren't what you would call Orthodox Muslims. They depart from Islam. So I always ask them, well, what kind of Muslim are you? I do the same thing with a Christian. What kind of Christian are you? I want to find out exactly, what are their beliefs and doctrines. And typically, people who are scientists, I mean, they're trained to think for themselves. So it's not surprising that they take a position that might depart from the orthodoxy of what they claim to adhere to. Incidentally, I found that to be true of Buddhists. I've met Buddhists who basically accept all the tenets of the Christian faith. And so, and they will admit that they borrow it from Christianity. And we need to understand too, Islam is kind of like Mormonism in that it's really a Christian sect in the sense that they take the Old New Testament, but they add a book to it. So the real debate is, okay, what do you think about the Old New Testament? How do you contrast that with the Quran? Do you see contradictions? And what do you think about this idea of a God being a triune being? I mean, if God is really going to redeem billions of human beings unto himself in a short period of time, then you got a problem with strict monotheism. I mean, how is God going to be able to pay the redemptive price and still be the one that creates the universe? And so what I've shared with a number of Muslim physicists is say, let's not really debate what the Quran says or the Bible says. Let's just look at the science. Does the science support this idea that God is one and only one? Or does it support the idea that God is polytheistic, like we see, for example, in Hinduism? Or is it like what we see in Christianity? a single God that is manifested in three distinct persons. And basically, I make the argument, based on what we know about science, science only makes sense if God is a triune being. And if God is a triune being, then we've got a rational answer, an understanding of how God can redeem billions of people unto themselves in the context of the laws of physics that we observe. And I've actually got an article on our reasons.org website explaining why science only makes sense if God is triune, and why it makes no sense at all if we're looking at, say, dozens of independent gods, or looking at a God that's all by himself. I mean, the problem I have with strict monotheism, where God is one person and only one person, how do you explain the origin of love? Love, by definition, requires that love be expressed and received from one person to another person. So if God is all alone, the only way he can experience love is to create beings. But now you've got God creating beings that can experience love, where he himself, before he created, had no experience of that at all. And what I find interesting about Islam is that nothing is greater than God. But a problem with Islam is they got the lesser creating the greater. And so that means that Islam, in that context at least, is self-contradictory. And as I've engaged Muslim scientists, this seems to be a really good approach for helping understand, you know what, you're right. There really is no good answer for the origin of love. I found this works with Jews as well, because a lot of Jews hold the same doctrine. And so just kind of going through all this.
Well, it's interesting that you have found that anything works in discussing religion, because I've found the opposite, that nothing works when it comes to discussing religion or politics. We're just so confused as a species. Dr. Ross, I want to respect your time, and I'd like to close with one final question. Can you tell listeners who might be interested in your work and what you're doing, what you're up to these days, and where they can find you or follow you?
Well, I just finished writing a book, and it's going to be in Cosmic Interior Designs, which is a follow-up in several other books I've written, basically making the point. Because what I've run into with a lot of non-believing scientists who say, you say every component of the universe, Earth, and Earth's life plays a role in the redemption of billions of human beings in every historical event. The response is, prove it. Well, I'm proving it through bringing out these books. And people can get a free chapter of 8 of my books by simply going to reasons.org/Ross. They can download a chapter for free. Our website is reasons.org. There's literally tens of thousands of articles and videos that you can read and watch for free. We also have a 24/7 YouTube channel. It's just YouTube Reasons to Believe. And literally, you'll find thousands of video clips that you can watch. So that's how people can engage us. And I do maintain a personal Facebook and Twitter page. And I don't tell you about the food I'm eating or what I'm doing. It's basically used as a vehicle to answer people's questions about science faith issues. So people are welcome to engage me on both Facebook and Twitter.
Well, fantastic. Dr. Ross, I'm really grateful for your time. I wish you the best in everything, and hopefully we'll come back and talk again with these about these very interesting topics.
Well, I appreciate it, because you asked some really good questions. I like the fact you wanted to go deep. So thank you.
If you like what you heard, stick around and let's reason together.